Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
The first snow of the season had arrived quietly, settling over the village like a polite visitor who did not wish to disturb anyone. By late afternoon, the roofs were lightly dusted, the hedgerows softened, and the narrow lanes gleamed faintly under the pale winter sky. Inside Rosebank Cottage, warmth and chatter reigned, for Mrs. Harriet Linton had insisted on hosting a small gathering to welcome an old acquaintance who had arrived unexpectedly that morning. It was nothing remarkable in itself. Guests came and went in villages like this all the time, and Mrs. Linton was known for her hospitality, especially when it allowed her to remind others of her social connections. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair near the window, a teacup balanced neatly beside her knitting basket. She observed the scene with gentle interest, her needles clicking softly as conversations overlapped and drifted like smoke. There was a sense of forced cheerfulness in the room, she thought, the sort that often accompanied reunions that were not entirely welcome. The guest, a tall man with careful manners and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, stood near the mantelpiece accepting compliments with practised ease. He had arrived earlier than expected, Mrs. Linton had said, as though this were a charming coincidence rather than a mild inconvenience. The tea-table was crowded with familiar faces, each one revealing something through posture and tone. Mrs. Linton hovered anxiously, refilling cups before they were empty. A younger woman sat stiffly on the edge of her chair, her gloved hands clenched in her lap, eyes flicking repeatedly toward the guest and then away. An older gentleman near the fire laughed a little too loudly at remarks that were barely amusing. Miss Marple noticed these things without appearing to, nodding pleasantly when spoken to, murmuring polite agreement, her expression one of mild, almost absent-minded contentment. The guest excused himself shortly after the cake was served. He claimed fatigue from travel and mentioned an early start the next morning. There was a moment of awkward silence as coats were fetched more quickly than expected. Mrs. Linton protested faintly, insisting he stay longer, but the guest was firm and courteous. He thanked everyone, shook hands, and departed into the fading light, his footsteps crunching softly on the snow outside. Miss Marple watched through the window as his figure disappeared beyond the gate. She noticed with quiet interest that no one else rose to see him off. Conversation resumed, but something had shifted. The laughter sounded thinner, the remarks more cautious. Someone commented on the cold, another on the snow, and soon there was talk of nothing at all. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though she had not lost the thread. She reflected on how departures could be as telling as arrivals, particularly when they came earlier than expected. The guest's smile, she recalled, had tightened ever so slightly as he reached the door, as though he were relieved to escape or anxious to do so before something changed. It was nearly dusk when the first sign of trouble appeared, though at the time it seemed trivial enough. Mrs. Linton mentioned that the guest had forgotten his gloves. They lay folded neatly on a side table, dark leather against the pale lace cloth. There was a small murmur of concern. Someone suggested sending them along later. Another remarked that he might return for them. Miss Marple glanced at the gloves, noticing how carefully they had been placed, as though set down with intention rather than forgotten in haste. She made no comment, only sipped her tea and listened. The gathering broke up soon after, guests dispersing into the cold evening with polite farewells and cautious smiles. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer than usual, helping Mrs. Linton collect cups and offering a few gentle words about the weather. As she left, she looked once more at the gloves, still untouched. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, thicker now, muffling sound and softening edges. The village lay quiet, lights glowing faintly behind drawn curtains. The next morning, the silence was broken. The guest had not returned to his lodgings, nor had he been seen at breakfast, as he had promised. His room was untouched, his bed unslept. By mid-morning, concern had turned to alarm, and by noon the inspector had arrived, his breath visible in the cold air as he listened to hurried explanations. Miss Marple stood a little apart from the crowd that gathered near the gate where the guest had last been seen. She observed faces pale with shock, eyes darting, hands fidgeting in pockets and mufflers. When the news came that a body had been found beyond the edge of the village, half buried in snow near the old footpath, there was a collective intake of breath. Words like accident and misadventure were whispered at once, clung to eagerly. Miss Marple did not speak. She looked instead at the reactions around her, at who asked questions and who avoided them, who seemed genuinely distressed, and who appeared merely unsettled by inconvenience. She thought of the early departure, the forgotten gloves, the careful manners, and the tension that had filled the room without anyone acknowledging it. As the inspector began his inquiries, Miss Marple quietly returned home, her mind already busy. She set her kettle on the stove and laid her knitting aside, knowing she would not need it just yet. There were patterns here, subtle but unmistakable, woven through human behavior rather than physical evidence. Someone had left too early, she reflected, and someone else had hoped very much that he would. By the following afternoon, the village no longer wore its peaceful winter face. Snow still lay pristine on lawns and rooftops, but the air itself seemed disturbed, as though every whispered word had weight. Doors opened and closed more frequently than usual, and people paused in the street for conversations that stopped abruptly when others approached. News travelled swiftly, reshaped with every telling, and by the time Miss Marple ventured out for her customary walk, there were already several versions of what had happened to the guest who had left Mrs. Linton's house so early the night before. At the post office, a small knot of villagers stood unusually close together, their voices lowered but urgent. Miss Marple joined the queue with patient serenity, her expression attentive yet unassuming. She heard someone insist it must have been a terrible accident, that the poor man had simply slipped on the icy path. Another voice contradicted this, reminding the group that the footpath was well maintained and familiar to anyone staying in the village. A third suggested that perhaps he had been unwell, overcome by sudden weakness. Each theory was delivered with confidence, as though certainty might banish fear. Miss Marple noticed who spoke most forcefully and who remained silent. The older gentleman from the tea-gathering, who had laughed so readily the previous day, now frowned deeply and said very little. The younger woman with the tight gloves offered no opinion at all, her eyes fixed on the counter as though the stamps were of intense interest. Mrs. Linton herself bustled in and out, assuring everyone that the inspector would sort things out quickly, that there was no need for alarm. Yet her hands shook faintly as she counted her coins. Outside, the inspector was already making his presence felt. He spoke politely but firmly, asking where the guest had been seen last, who had spoken with him, who had noticed anything unusual. The villagers answered readily enough, though their recollections varied in detail and emphasis. Miss Marple passed nearby just as Mrs. Linton explained, for the third time, how unexpectedly early the guest had departed, how tired he had claimed to be. She added that he was not the sort of man to wander aimlessly at night. Miss Marple thought this a curious remark, considering how little anyone truly knew of him. Later, at the grocer's, another conversation unfolded. Someone recalled a brief exchange between the guest and a villager near the garden gate, a low-voiced discussion that had ended abruptly when others approached. Someone else remembered seeing a shadow moving along the hedge not long after the guest had left. These details grew more dramatic with each repetition, acquiring urgency where none had been evident before. Miss Marple listened carefully, her mild nods encouraging further recollection. She did not ask questions directly. Experience had taught her that people revealed more when they believed they were doing so of their own accord. As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of gossip. It was rarely malicious at first, she knew, but it had a way of sharpening edges, turning uncertainty into accusation. She recalled other villages, other tragedies, where the truth had been buried beneath assumptions made too quickly. The inspector, she suspected, would soon have an obvious explanation offered to him, complete with a suitable suspect. Villages, like individuals, preferred tidy answers. That evening Miss Marple received her first visitor. The younger woman from the tea gathering arrived unannounced, cheeks flushed from the cold and from something else Miss Marple could not immediately name. She spoke nervously, apologizing for disturbing Miss Marple, then launched into a halting account of how shocking the whole affair was, how dreadful to think such a thing could happen in such a quiet place. She insisted she knew nothing of importance, that she had left early herself and noticed nothing amiss. She lingered longer than necessary, repeating herself, watching Miss Marple's face for some sign of judgment. Miss Marple responded with gentle sympathy, offering tea and a biscuit. Remarking on how unsettling sudden events could be, she mentioned, almost idly, how people often remembered things only after they believed it was safe to do so. The younger woman stiffened slightly at this, then smiled too quickly and declined further tea. When she left, Miss Marple watched her go with thoughtful eyes, noting how her footsteps hurried once she reached the lane. Not long after, Mrs. Linton called, her manner brisk but strained. She spoke at length about the inspector's questions, about how tiresome it all was, about how dreadful it must be for the poor man's family. She assured Miss Marple that there was nothing unusual about the guest's visit, nothing at all. Miss Marple agreed politely, though she observed that people rarely defended the ordinary so energetically unless they feared it might appear otherwise. Mrs. Linton, too, left in a hurry, forgetting her gloves by the door, only to return moments later for them, flustered and apologetic. As night fell, the village settled into an uneasy quiet. Lamps glowed behind curtains, and the snow reflected their light faintly, making the lanes appear brighter than usual. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting in hand once more, though her needles paused often. She considered the reactions she had seen, the eagerness to explain away the death, the reluctance to examine it too closely. She thought of the forgotten gloves, of the guest's careful departure, of the relief she had glimpsed in more than one face when he failed to return. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was remarkably consistent. Fear, resentment, relief, guilt, all played out in familiar patterns, no matter how tranquil the setting. Someone in the village knew more than they were saying. Perhaps several people did. The truth would not announce itself loudly, she knew. It would reveal itself quietly, in small contradictions and overlooked details, to anyone patient enough to watch. The next morning brought a brittle clarity to the village, the kind that followed a restless night. Snow had hardened into a crust that crunched sharply underfoot, announcing every movement. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and took particular care over her routine, for she found that ordinary actions often created opportunities for observation. By the time she stepped outside, she had already decided that this would be a day for listening rather than speaking. The inspector had established himself in the small sitting room of Mrs. Linton's house, and villagers were being summoned in ones and twos. Those who returned did so with an air of injured dignity or performative calm, depending on temperament. Miss Marple passed Mrs. Linton's gate just as one such interview concluded. The older gentleman from the tea-gathering emerged, hat pulled low, his mouth set in a thin line. He did not notice Miss Marple at first, and when he did, he nodded stiffly and hurried away, as though anxious to be anywhere else. Miss Marple continued on toward the lane that led past the allotments. There she encountered the man who maintained them, busy with a shovel despite the cold. He greeted her readily enough and spoke of the weather before drifting, without prompting, to the matter on everyone's mind. He described hearing voices the previous evening, raised but indistinct, and insisted he could not say who they belonged to. Miss Marple listened attentively, remarking only that snow had a way of carrying sound. At this the man frowned and amended his account slightly, suggesting perhaps he had heard only one voice after all. Miss Marple thanked him and moved on, her expression thoughtful. Later, at the baker's, she found a more animated scene. The counter was crowded, and conversation flowed freely, punctuated by nervous laughter. Someone insisted that the guest had been a disagreeable sort, though no one could recall him being openly rude. Another suggested he'd been asking questions about people's pasts, which naturally invited suspicion. Miss Marple observed how these accusations were made with increasing confidence, despite being supported by little more than vague impressions. She also noticed how one woman, standing slightly apart, flinched at the mention of questions and abruptly left without making a purchase. By midday, the inspector had expanded his inquiries. He visited the allotments, the churchyard, the path the guest had taken when he left early. He examined footprints half buried by fresh snowfall and accepted theories offered with enthusiasm by villagers eager to assist. Miss Marple watched from a distance as he nodded gravely, his notebook filling steadily. She had seen this before, the careful accumulation of facts that seemed solid but were often shaped by the teller's intent. In the afternoon, Miss Marple was invited to tea by a neighbour who professed herself deeply shaken by recent events. The invitation, Miss Marple suspected, had more to do with curiosity than comfort. Over delicate cups and slightly over-buttered scones, the neighbour speculated freely, hinting that the guest's death might expose something unpleasant about Mrs. Linton's household. She spoke with relish, pausing frequently to gauge Miss Marple's reaction. Miss Marple responded with mild surprise and a reminder that appearances could be deceptive. The neighbour laughed this off but did not pursue the topic further, clearly disappointed. As the day wore on, Miss Marple found her thoughts returning to small details that others had dismissed. The guest's decision to leave early had been accepted too readily as mere fatigue. Yet several people had remarked upon it independently, as though rehearsing a shared explanation. She recalled, too, the subtle relief she had glimpsed when his absence became known. Relief was not the response one expected to tragedy, unless tragedy had resolved something troublesome. Toward evening, Miss Marple received a brief visit from the inspector himself. He was courteous, almost indulgent, explaining that he wished to be thorough, and that Mrs. Linton had mentioned Miss Marple's presence at the gathering. He asked whether she had noticed anything unusual. Miss Marple replied that nothing had struck her at the time, though she added that people often revealed their true feelings when they believed themselves unobserved. The inspector smiled politely, clearly interpreting this as a harmless generality, and moved on to more direct questions. Miss Marple answered each calmly, offering no theories of her own. After he left, Miss Marple reflected on his manner. He was diligent, she thought, but inclined to trust too easily in what was presented to him. Villagers had a way of presenting a united front when it suited them, smoothing over discord until it appeared harmless. She suspected that someone had relied on this very tendency. As dusk settled, Miss Marple took another short walk. The lamps were being lit, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from evening fires. She paused near the hedge where someone had claimed to see a shadow the previous night. Nothing appeared remarkable now, yet she noticed how the hedge concealed a narrow opening, easily missed, leading toward the back of Mrs. Linton's property. It would have provided a discreet route for anyone wishing to avoid the main path. Returning home, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty begin to form. The truth was not hidden by complexity, but by familiarity. The villagers' reactions, their eagerness to explain and absolve, spoke more loudly than their words. Someone had been very keen that the guest should leave unnoticed and never return, and someone else, perhaps more than one, was complicit in ensuring that no one looked too closely at why. Miss Marple resumed her knitting by the fire, already anticipating the moment when a small, overlooked detail would unravel everything. The village settled into an uneasy rhythm after the small revelations of the previous days. People still greeted one another on the lanes and lingered by the hedges to exchange pleasantries, but there was a guarded quality to every smile, as though each villager were measuring their words. Miss Marple noticed it at once. Human nature, she reflected, rarely changed, only the circumstances did. When secrets were threatened, even the most respectable people grew cautious. She spent the morning in her sitting room, ostensibly absorbed in her knitting, though her eyes were more often on the garden path beyond the window. Shortly before noon, a visitor arrived in the form of a young woman from the post office, who brought with her a bundle of misdirected letters discovered behind a sorting shelf. The girl apologized profusely, explaining that they appeared to have been tucked away some weeks earlier by mistake. Miss Marple thanked her kindly and examined the envelopes once the door was closed. 2 of the letters were innocuous bills, long overdue and already resolved. The third, however, caught her attention. It bore a familiar hand and was addressed to someone who, according to village gossip, had no reason to receive private correspondence. The letter had been opened and resealed, clumsily. Miss Marple's lips tightened. It was rarely an accident when such things occurred. She slipped the envelope back into its place and resolved to ask a few careful questions. Later that afternoon, she took her customary walk, pausing to admire the roses outside the vicarage. The vicar himself joined her, looking tired and distracted. He spoke of the strain the recent events had placed upon the parish, and admitted, with some embarrassment, that he feared certain members of his congregation were not being entirely truthful. Miss Marple murmured sympathy and asked in her gentle way whether he had noticed anyone behaving out of character during recent services. The vicar hesitated before mentioning a name, then another, both people known for their rigid propriety. They had attended church faithfully, but lately one had avoided eye contact while the other left before speaking to anyone. Miss Marple thanked him and changed the subject, but her mind was already at work fitting these observations into a growing pattern. As she continued on her walk, she encountered the woman who ran the small tea-room near the green. Over tea and a slice of seed cake, the woman spoke freely, as tea-room proprietors often did. She mentioned a disagreement she had witnessed some weeks earlier, late in the afternoon when the shop should have been empty. 2 familiar villagers had argued in hushed voices, their faces pale with anger. The subject, she believed, concerned money and something that ought never to come out. Miss Marple listened with great interest and asked just enough questions to encourage further recollection without appearing curious. By the time she returned home, the outline of events was becoming clearer, though several details remained stubbornly obscure. She sat by the fire as dusk fell, thinking of a long-ago case involving a seemingly harmless misunderstanding that had concealed a deliberate deception. People, she reminded herself, were very good at convincing themselves of their own innocence. The following morning brought another development. A note was delivered by hand, requesting Miss Marple's presence at a nearby cottage. The handwriting was hurried, almost desperate. When she arrived, she found its occupant agitated and fearful, glancing repeatedly toward the window as though expecting to be observed. The woman confessed that she had overheard something she ought not to have heard, a conversation suggesting that an accident might not have been accidental at all. She had told no one, afraid of the consequences, but the strain had become unbearable. Miss Marple listened patiently, offering reassurance without making promises she could not keep. When the story was finished, she asked 1 or 2 precise questions that caused the woman to falter. Certain details did not align. Gently, Miss Marple pointed this out, not accusingly, but as one might correct a mistaken recollection. The woman's composure broke, and she admitted that she had altered part of the truth to protect someone close to her. Walking home afterward, Miss Marple felt both sympathy and resolve. Protectiveness, she knew, was often the root of terrible decisions. The desire to shield a loved one could push ordinary people toward extraordinary acts. She recalled the opened letter and the whispered argument in the tea-room, and she was certain now that the pieces were connected. That evening, she received an unexpected visitor. The person arrived unannounced and spoke with forced cheerfulness, praising Miss Marple's insight and asking leading questions about her thoughts on the case. Miss Marple answered vaguely, watching the visitor's hands tremble despite the calm tone. When the visitor finally left, Miss Marple was convinced she had just been tested. Someone was afraid of what she might discover. She extinguished the lamp and sat in the darkness for a while, reflecting on the frailty of human arrangements. Respectability, secrecy, fear, and love had woven themselves into a tight knot, and at its center lay the truth. Miss Marple knew that the coming days would bring confrontation and confession, but for now she allowed herself a moment of quiet certainty. The village believed it still held its secrets. It was mistaken. Morning arrived with a deceptive calm, the sort that often followed nights of restless thought. Miss Marple woke earlier than usual and sat for a long while by her bedroom window, observing the slow stirring of the village. Curtains twitched, doors opened briefly and then shut again, as though everyone were aware of being watched. She could not help but think how easily people forgot that a village, for all its charm, was never truly private. After breakfast she paid a visit to the small grocer's shop, a place where news travelled faster than goods. The proprietor greeted her warmly but with a hint of strain, and it took little encouragement for him to speak of declining trade and unpaid accounts. One name came up more than once, mentioned with an apologetic shrug. Miss Marple listened carefully. Financial pressures had a way of bringing hidden matters to the surface, especially when pride prevented honesty. As she left the shop, she noticed two villagers speaking together at the corner of the street. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they saw her, and one of them flushed deeply before offering an exaggerated greeting. Miss Marple smiled back, her manner as innocent as ever, though she marked the moment in her mind. People rarely stopped speaking unless they feared being overheard. She continued on to the library, where the air was cool and the shelves smelled faintly of dust and polish. The librarian, a meticulous woman with a sharp memory for dates and details, assisted Miss Marple in locating old parish records and newspapers. Miss Marple explained that she was curious about a long-ago incident, something minor, really, involving a disagreement over property boundaries. The librarian produced the requested volumes and, after a moment's hesitation, added another paper not asked for. It contained a brief notice of an inquest from many years before, describing an incident officially ruled an accident. Miss Marple read it slowly. Certain phrases struck her as familiar, echoing details from recent conversations. She thanked the librarian and tucked the information away, her suspicions now more firmly grounded in fact rather than intuition alone. At midday she accepted an invitation to luncheon, joining several villagers gathered around a cheerful table. The conversation was polite but edged with nervousness. Someone mentioned the weather too often, another laughed at remarks that were not particularly amusing. Miss Marple contributed little, content to observe. When the talk turned, inevitably, to recent troubles, opinions were offered quickly and with surprising unanimity. It was always suspicious, Miss Marple thought, when everyone agreed too readily. One guest spoke passionately about loyalty and the importance of protecting one's own. Another countered with a stiff speech about truth and justice. The exchange ended awkwardly, leaving a silence heavy with meaning. Miss Marple sipped her tea and reflected that both sentiments, admirable in isolation, could become dangerous when twisted by fear. In the afternoon she called upon an elderly man known for his long memory and longer silences. He received her with evident relief, as though grateful for company. Over biscuits he spoke of the village as it once was, naming people long gone and events half forgotten. Gradually he came to a particular family and lowered his voice. There had been tensions, he said, quiet ones, concerning inheritance and promises made but never kept. Miss Marple asked whether those tensions had ever led to threats or harsh words. The man nodded, then quickly shook his head, correcting himself. He claimed his memory was failing, but his eyes told a different story. Miss Marple did not press him. She had learned long ago that forcing a confession often closed more doors than it opened. Walking home, she considered the threads she had gathered. Financial strain, old grievances, altered stories, and a collective desire to preserve appearances all pointed in the same direction. Yet there remained a missing element, something that explained not just motive but opportunity. She suspected that the answer lay in a moment everyone had dismissed as insignificant. That evening, as the light faded, Miss Marple received another letter. This one was anonymous, its message brief and urgent, warning her to stop asking questions. She folded it neatly and placed it on the mantelpiece. Anonymous warnings were rarely intended to deter. More often they betrayed panic. She sat quietly, her knitting untouched, and thought of a case from her youth involving a village not unlike this one. Then, as now, the truth had been obscured by kindnesses, favors, and shared secrets. It had taken a single overlooked detail to unravel everything. By the time she retired for the night, Miss Marple felt certain she was close to that detail. The village believed itself united, but unity born of fear was fragile. Sooner or later someone would speak, whether from guilt, anger, or desperation. When that happened, Miss Marple intended to be ready. The following morning brought a change in the village atmosphere that Miss Marple sensed at once. The quiet tension of the previous days had sharpened into something more brittle. Doors closed more firmly, greetings were shorter, and even the bird song seemed subdued. Miss Marple took her usual walk, observing everything with mild interest, as though her thoughts were on nothing more serious than the condition of the hedgerows. She paused near the postbox, where two women were arguing in low voices. One accused the other of spreading tales that were not hers to tell. When they noticed Miss Marple, the argument stopped, replaced by forced smiles and stiff politeness. Miss Marple murmured something about the weather and moved on, but she had already noted the tremor in one voice and the quick defensiveness in the other. Accusations, even whispered ones, often revealed more about the accuser than the accused. Later that morning she received a visit from the local constable, who came under the pretense of routine questioning. He was respectful, if a little dismissive, and spoke at length about progress being made and matters nearly settled. Miss Marple listened attentively, nodding in agreement, while quietly noting what he did not say. Certain names were conspicuously absent, and certain timelines glossed over. When he left, he seemed relieved, as though reassured that she posed no threat to his conclusions. After luncheon, Miss Marple busied herself with small domestic tasks, though her mind was elsewhere. She replayed conversations, gestures, and expressions, searching for a pattern. One detail continued to trouble her, a moment during the gathering when a particular remark had drawn an odd reaction from someone who should have found it harmless. At the time, it had seemed trivial, but trivialities were often the key to understanding larger deceptions. In the afternoon, she paid a call on a woman known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. The woman welcomed her eagerly, clearly delighted to have an audience. She spoke freely of village life, of who disliked whom, and who had been seen where at inconvenient times. Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward the evening of the incident, asking seemingly naive questions. The woman answered readily, then contradicted herself without noticing. Miss Marple asked her to repeat a particular detail, and the woman hesitated before offering a revised version. The hesitation was slight, but unmistakable. Miss Marple thanked her warmly and took her leave, her thoughts racing. People who altered their stories rarely did so without reason, even if the reason was simply fear of being implicated. As dusk approached, Miss Marple encountered a young man loitering near the edge of the village green. He greeted her awkwardly and offered to walk with her. During their stroll, he spoke of his uncertainty about staying in the village, of opportunities elsewhere. Miss Marple encouraged him kindly, remarking that sometimes a change of scenery brought clarity. He looked at her sharply, then away again, as though her words had struck closer to home than she intended. Before parting, he mentioned, almost casually, that he had seen someone walking alone late on the night in question, though he had not thought it important at the time. Miss Marple asked a few gentle questions, careful not to alarm him. His description was vague but sufficient to confirm her growing suspicions. She thanked him and wished him well, leaving him looking thoughtful and uneasy. That evening a small gathering took place at a neighbour's house, ostensibly to restore a sense of normalcy. Miss Marple attended, sitting quietly with her knitting. The conversation flowed around her, touching on safe subjects before drifting, inevitably, toward the incident. One guest laughed too loudly, another grew pale. Miss Marple made a mild comment about human nature, comparing it to a piece of knitting that unravelled if one pulled the wrong thread. Several people glanced at her uneasily. As the evening wore on, tempers frayed. An accusation slipped out, quickly retracted, but not before its effect was felt. Voices rose, then fell into embarrassed silence. Miss Marple watched closely, noting who sought to calm the room and who withdrew into themselves. Guilt and innocence, she reflected, often revealed themselves in opposite ways under pressure. When she returned home, she sat by the fire, reviewing everything she had learned. The anonymous letter, the altered stories, the old grievances, and now the sighting offered by the young man all pointed toward a deliberate deception, carefully constructed but imperfectly maintained. One person, she was certain, had underestimated how closely ordinary behavior could be observed. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and wrote a short note, inviting a particular individual to take tea with her the following afternoon. The invitation was phrased warmly, without any hint of suspicion. She sealed the envelope with a calm hand. Tomorrow she intended to test her conclusions, not through confrontation, but through conversation. Human nature, she knew, rarely withstood gentle scrutiny for long. Miss Marple rose early the next day with a feeling of quiet anticipation. The invitation she had sent had been accepted promptly, almost too promptly, and that alone confirmed her instinct that she was moving in the right direction. She prepared the sitting room with care, setting out the best china and arranging the chairs so that conversation would flow naturally. Nothing unsettles a guilty mind more than an atmosphere of ordinary kindness. Her guest arrived precisely on time, wearing an expression of polite ease that did not quite reach the eyes. Miss Marple greeted them warmly, remarking on how pleasant it was to enjoy a peaceful afternoon after so much excitement in the village. The guest agreed readily, speaking at length about the strain everyone had been under, and how fortunate it was that matters would soon be resolved. Miss Marple listened with interest, offering sympathetic murmurs while carefully observing posture, tone, and timing. As tea was poured, Miss Marple mentioned, quite casually, an old acquaintance from another village, who had once misunderstood a simple situation and suffered greatly for it. The story seemed harmless, even dull, yet she noticed a flicker of tension pass across her guest's face. The cup paused briefly before being lifted. Such tiny hesitations often spoke louder than words. The conversation drifted to village routines, then to the evening of the incident. Miss Marple asked gentle, almost foolish questions, as though trying to recall details she could not quite grasp. Her guest answered smoothly at first, recounting familiar facts already repeated to others. Then Miss Marple asked about a minor point, something no one else appeared to have considered significant. The reply came too quickly, rehearsed rather than remembered. Miss Marple smiled and apologized for her poor memory, yet she returned to the subject a few minutes later, phrasing the question differently. This time the answer changed slightly. The guest laughed it off, blaming confusion and fatigue, but the laugh sounded thin. Miss Marple noted the tightening of hands and the sudden interest taken in a crack in the teacup. She shifted tactics, speaking of village gossip and how unreliable it could be. She mentioned, as an aside, that she had spoken with several people recently, all of whom remembered events in their own particular way. The guest stiffened almost imperceptibly, then asked who these people were. Miss Marple waved the question away, remarking that it hardly mattered. Everyone saw what they wished to see after all. A silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Miss Marple used it deliberately, pouring more tea and commenting on the weather. The guest filled the silence with unnecessary chatter, explaining actions that had not been questioned. Miss Marple's eyes softened with apparent sympathy, but her mind was sharp and alert. Unasked explanations were rarely innocent. At last she spoke of the anonymous letter, not accusingly, but with mild puzzlement. She wondered aloud who could have written such a thing, and what motive they might have had. Her guest responded with a carefully neutral tone, suggesting mischief or malice. Yet when Miss Marple remarked that the letter writer seemed to know very specific details, the guest's composure slipped. A flush rose to the cheeks, quickly suppressed. Miss Marple leaned back, knitting resting idle in her lap. She spoke softly now, recalling an incident from her youth involving a woman who tried very hard to appear helpful, while quietly steering suspicion away from herself. The parallel was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone listening closely. Her guest's smile faded, replaced by a guarded expression. The doorbell rang suddenly, startling them both. Miss Marple rose calmly and admitted another visitor, someone she had invited for a brief call. The newcomer greeted them cheerfully and mentioned, without malice, a small inconsistency they had noticed in the guest's earlier account of events. The remark was innocent, almost trivial, yet its effect was immediate. The guest's composure cracked, just for a moment, revealing fear beneath the surface. Miss Marple thanked the visitor and sent them on their way, apologizing for the interruption. When she returned to her chair, she spoke kindly, saying how difficult it must be to live with constant anxiety. The guest looked at her sharply, then away. A long pause followed, heavy with unspoken words. At length the guest attempted to regain control, insisting on their innocence and expressing offence at the implications. Miss Marple did not argue. She merely nodded and said she quite understood, adding that the truth had a way of emerging on its own, especially when many small observations pointed in the same direction. She spoke of human nature, of how people often betrayed themselves without realizing it. The guest rose to leave, clearly eager to escape the quiet scrutiny of the room. Miss Marple accompanied them to the door, thanking them warmly for coming. As they parted, Miss Marple made one final remark, gentle and almost affectionate, about how burdensome secrets could become when carried alone. The guest hesitated, as if about to speak, then thought better of it and departed in silence. Left alone, Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting once more. Her hands were steady, her expression serene. The afternoon had confirmed what she already knew. The deception was unraveling thread by thread, and the one who had woven it was beginning to realize that escape was no longer possible. Soon, very soon, the truth would have to be faced. The mood of the village shifted noticeably in the days that followed, though most people could not have said exactly why. It was as if an invisible tension had settled over the hedges and cottages, making every greeting slightly strained and every conversation cautious. Doors closed a little faster, curtains twitched a little longer, and even the birds seemed quieter in the early mornings. Miss Marple noticed these things with gentle interest, for villages, like people, often revealed their secrets through atmosphere rather than speech. She continued her routine as usual, walking slowly to the shops, pausing to exchange pleasantries, and listening far more than she spoke. What she heard was revealing. Stories were beginning to change. Details once stated with confidence were now hedged with uncertainty. People corrected themselves mid-sentence or insisted they had never said a thing that Miss Marple distinctly remembered hearing. Fear, she reflected, was a most disruptive influence on memory. At the post office, a whispered conversation abruptly stopped when she entered. At the butcher's, an argument flared between two customers over something trivial and then ended just as quickly, both parties flushed and uneasy. Miss Marple smiled and commented on the weather, allowing everyone to relax again. Nothing puts people more at ease than believing an elderly woman was entirely harmless. Later that afternoon, she received a visit from someone who claimed merely to be checking on her health after the recent excitement. The concern was polite but strained, and Miss Marple could sense the real purpose beneath it. The visitor asked several indirect questions, circling carefully around the subject of the crime without quite touching it. Miss Marple answered with mild vagueness, praising the efficiency of the authorities and expressing hope that matters would soon be resolved. What interested her most was not what the visitor said, but what they avoided saying. Certain names were conspicuously absent from the conversation. Certain times and places were glossed over with a hurried change of subject. Miss Marple stored these omissions away, knowing that what people refused to mention often mattered more than what they emphasized. That evening, as dusk settled, news arrived that unsettled the village further. An object connected, however tenuously, to the night of the disappearance had been found. It was not dramatic, nor was it conclusive, but it reopened questions many had hoped were closed. The discovery was discussed with nervous excitement, each person interpreting it in a way that supported their preferred theory. Miss Marple listened, knitting quietly, her eyes thoughtful. She was particularly interested in the reactions rather than the words. One person dismissed the find too quickly, laughing in a way that rang false. Another became overly earnest, insisting it proved what they had believed all along. A third fell silent altogether, withdrawing from the conversation as if it no longer felt safe. Miss Marple noted them all, recognizing familiar patterns she had seen many times before. The police presence increased, and with it came a sense of urgency. Officers moved through the village, asking renewed questions, comparing statements, and gently pointing out inconsistencies. Most villagers cooperated willingly, eager to appear helpful. A few, however, grew defensive, interpreting every inquiry as a personal attack. Miss Marple had always found that innocence rarely needed such vigorous protection. One evening she encountered someone on a narrow lane, their meeting clearly accidental yet awkward. Polite words were exchanged, but beneath them lay suspicion and resentment. Miss Marple observed the tightness of the smile, the way the person's gaze darted toward the hedgerow as if expecting to be overheard. When Miss Marple remarked how tiring secrets could be, the response was sharp enough to betray nerves stretched thin. As the days passed, relationships began to fray. Long-standing friendships cooled, and old grievances resurfaced with surprising intensity. Miss Marple reflected that crime rarely created new conflicts, it merely illuminated those already present. The village had always been a place of quiet rivalries and concealed resentments. Now, under pressure, they were breaking through the surface. One afternoon, Miss Marple made a point of visiting someone who had been conspicuously absent from recent gatherings. She found them restless and distracted, speaking too much and saying very little. When Miss Marple gently mentioned how isolation could make matters seem worse than they were, the person reacted with sudden irritation, quickly followed by an apology. The emotional whiplash told Miss Marple more than any confession might have. That night, as she sat alone, Miss Marple reviewed everything she had seen and heard. The pattern was clear now, though still invisible to most. The missing piece had never been physical evidence, but a motive shaped by fear and desperation. Someone had believed themselves cornered, convinced that silence was the only escape. In trying to preserve their own safety, they had created the very danger they feared. The next morning brought another development, quieter but more telling. A statement was amended, supposedly to correct an innocent mistake. The correction, however, aligned too neatly with newly uncovered information. Miss Marple smiled faintly when she heard of it. People rarely realized how transparent such adjustments could be when viewed in the proper context. She sensed that the moment of reckoning was approaching. The village could feel it too, though most mistook the feeling for general unease. Miss Marple moved carefully now, saying little, watching everything. She knew that pressure would soon force the truth into the open, not through accusation or confrontation, but through the simple weight of accumulated observation. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent. Given enough time, people always revealed themselves. All that was required was patience, attention, and the willingness to see what others preferred to ignore. By the time the village gathered again under the polite pretext of a routine meeting, tension had hardened into something almost tangible. People smiled, nodded, and took their seats, yet their eyes betrayed them, flicking too quickly toward certain faces and lingering too long on others. Miss Marple sat quietly near the edge, hands folded, her expression mild and pleasantly attentive. To anyone watching, she appeared merely an elderly lady grateful for company. To those who knew her better, there was something unusually intent in the way she listened. The conversation began harmlessly enough, touching on ordinary matters, but it did not take long before it drifted, as it inevitably did, toward the unresolved crime. Voices grew cautious, statements were carefully phrased. Miss Marple noticed how often people spoke in generalities now, as though specifics might prove dangerous. She also noticed who avoided eye contact when certain details were mentioned, and who seemed almost eager for the discussion to move on. At a carefully chosen moment, Miss Marple spoke. Her voice was gentle, her words framed as an idle recollection of something similar she had once witnessed years before. She described a small misunderstanding in another village, how a single incorrect assumption had led everyone astray for weeks. Her story was unremarkable on the surface, but she watched closely as she spoke. One listener stiffened almost imperceptibly. Another leaned forward, frowning, as if suddenly alert to a parallel they had not expected. Miss Marple continued, remarking how people often believed they were being clever when they adjusted their stories, not realizing how such changes stood out when placed alongside earlier versions. She laughed softly at her own supposed foolishness, claiming she often mixed up dates and times herself. The effect was immediate. A flush crept up one face. Another person shifted in their seat, hands clasping and unclasping nervously. Someone attempted to interrupt with a change of subject, but Miss Marple pressed on with serene persistence. She spoke of human nature, of how fear could make even sensible people act rashly, and how guilt often expressed itself not through silence but through over-explanation. The room grew very quiet. Every word seemed to echo more loudly than it should have. Then Miss Marple did something unexpected. She addressed one person directly, though still with the utmost politeness. She asked an innocent question, phrased as a request for clarification about a minor detail that had never seemed important. The question was simple. The answer, however, came too quickly, too rehearsed. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly as if puzzled, and gently pointed out a small contradiction between that answer and something said earlier in the week. The reaction was unmistakable. The person's composure fractured for a fleeting moment. There was anger, then fear, then a hurried attempt to recover. Others noticed it too. Murmurs rippled through the room, quickly stifled but impossible to fully suppress. Miss Marple said nothing more, allowing the silence to do its work. At that point, the police officer present stepped forward, emboldened by what he had observed. He asked a few direct questions, no longer content with vague reassurances. The answers came haltingly now, each one digging the hole a little deeper. Miss Marple watched with quiet satisfaction. She had always believed that truth emerged most effectively when allowed to reveal itself. The final pressure came not from accusation, but from inevitability. Faced with mounting inconsistencies and the sudden shift in the room's mood, the person broke. The confession, when it came, was not dramatic, but weary and resentful. Words spilled out in a rush, explaining motives rooted in old grievances and a fear of exposure. It was not malice alone that had driven them, but a desperate belief that there had been no other way. As the explanation unfolded, the pieces fell into place with painful clarity. The small lies, the altered timelines, the exaggerated indignation, all aligned neatly now. Miss Marple listened without triumph. She felt no satisfaction in being right, only a familiar sadness at the predictable frailty of human behavior. When it was over, the room felt drained. Some people looked shocked, others relieved, and a few seemed quietly ashamed of their earlier certainty. The police led the culprit away, and no one tried to stop them. Conversations resumed in low, uncertain tones, already reshaping the narrative into something they could live with. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, gazing around the room. She could see how quickly the village was preparing to heal, smoothing over the rupture with polite forgetfulness. Soon enough, life would return to its routines, though the memory of what had happened would linger like a faint scar. As she rose to leave, someone thanked her, voice thick with emotion. Miss Marple smiled kindly and dismissed her own role with a wave of the hand. She said she had merely listened and remembered a few old lessons. Outside, the air felt lighter, though still cold. She walked home slowly, reflecting that the hardest truths were rarely hidden very deeply. People buried them under habit and denial, trusting that no one would look closely enough to uncover them. The days that followed settled into a quieter rhythm, as though the village itself were cautiously testing its own heartbeat. People returned to their routines with deliberate care, greeting one another politely, avoiding any mention of what had occurred unless necessity demanded it. Doors were closed a little more firmly at night, curtains drawn a little earlier. The crime had been resolved, yet its shadow lingered in subtle ways, altering familiar habits and unspoken assumptions. Miss Marple noticed these changes during her daily walks. She observed how conversations stopped abruptly when she approached, only to resume with forced brightness. She saw the careful kindness extended toward those most closely affected, kindness that carried beneath it a shared discomfort. The village was attempting to be normal again, but normality, once disrupted, never returned in quite the same shape. One afternoon, Miss Marple was invited to tea by a neighbor who seemed particularly eager for reassurance. The cups were laid out neatly, the biscuits arranged with almost excessive precision. The conversation hovered around safe topics at first, then slowly edged closer to the truth of things. Her companion confessed to feeling foolish, having believed so firmly in the wrong explanation. Miss Marple listened with sympathy, remarking gently that certainty was a luxury few people could afford when emotions were involved. She suggested that it was often easier to accept a simple story than a complicated one that reflected poorly on familiar faces. News from the authorities arrived quietly. The case was considered closed, the details recorded and filed away. There would be no further public proceedings that required the village's attention. This knowledge brought relief, though not quite peace. Some villagers found themselves replaying moments in their minds, recognizing now the small signs they had overlooked. Others preferred not to think about it at all. Miss Marple, however, reflected constantly, not on the mechanics of the crime, but on the patterns that had led to it. She thought of how long resentments could fester unnoticed, how fear could distort judgment, and how easily ordinary people convinced themselves that silence was the safest course. None of it surprised her. Human nature, she believed, was remarkably consistent, regardless of time or place. One evening she sat by her window, knitting steadily, watching as lights appeared one by one across the village. Life continued, as it always did. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere else a door closed softly. These small, ordinary sounds reassured her more than any official conclusion ever could. A few days later, a letter arrived, written in a careful, formal hand. It was a note of thanks from someone directly affected by the crime, expressing gratitude not only for the truth, but for the manner in which it had been revealed. Miss Marple read it slowly, then placed it away without comment. She did not consider herself deserving of praise. She had simply done what she always did, watched, listened, and remembered. When she next encountered the police officer who had worked the case, he spoke candidly of his surprise at how easily he might have been misled. Miss Marple responded with a mild smile, saying that assumptions were very convenient things, particularly when they align with our own expectations. She added that people often revealed more through what they emphasized than through what they tried to hide. The officer nodded thoughtfully, clearly resolving to remember that lesson. As the weeks passed, the village's surface calm grew more convincing. Social gatherings resumed. Laughter returned, though occasionally it rang a little too loudly, as if to prove something. Miss Marple attended these events as she always had, unobtrusive and pleasant, content to be underestimated. She noticed how the experience had subtly altered the way people regarded one another. There was more caution now, but also, in some cases, a deeper kindness born of shared vulnerability. On a crisp morning, Miss Marple took a longer walk than usual, venturing beyond the village boundary. The countryside lay quiet and undisturbed, indifferent to human dramas. She found comfort in that indifference. It reminded her that while human failings were inevitable, they were not all-encompassing. There was still beauty, still order, still the possibility of grace. She paused to rest on a familiar bench, thinking of all the cases she had encountered over the years. Each one had ended differently, yet they all shared a common thread. People rarely acted without reason, even when their actions were terrible. Understanding those reasons did not excuse the harm, but it did make the world a little less bewildering. When she finally returned home, she tidied her sitting room, set out her knitting, and prepared for a quiet evening. The village lay peaceful outside her window, its troubles temporarily laid to rest. Miss Marple knew, however, that peace was never permanent. Somewhere, someday, another ordinary moment would be disrupted, another secret exposed. Until then, she would wait, observe, and remember. Human nature would not change, but understanding it remained, she believed, the closest thing to justice that one could hope for.